Picture this. You are 6 years old, standing in a room so cold your breath forms little clouds, and the most powerful man in the world is deciding whether you're worth keeping alive. Your small fingers clutch a wooden doll, the only thing that feels real in this marble palace, where even the air seems to whisper secrets you're too young to understand. The man they call your grandfather sits behind a desk, carved from a single piece of ivory, his fingers drumming against its surface as he studies scrolls covered in names. Some names get crossed out with thick black ink, others get circled. You've learned not to ask what happens to the crossed out ones. Your nurse, Claudia, stands beside you with hands that shake when she thinks no one is looking. "Come here, child," he says without looking up. Your legs feel like water, but you step forward until you're close enough to smell the wine on his breath and see the liver spots on his hands. These are the hands that built an empire, that command armies across the known world, that decide who lives and who simply disappears. "Do you know who I am?" he asks, and his voice sounds like grinding stone. "Yes, grandfather," you whisper, though the word feels strange in your mouth. Augustus, for that's what everyone calls him when they think you can't hear, isn't like the grandfathers in the stories Claudia tells. He doesn't bounce you on his knee or bring you sweets from the market. His love, if it exists at all, comes with conditions written in languages you haven't learned yet. And do you know what that makes you? He leans forward, and you catch a glimpse of something calculating in his pale eyes, the same look he wears when receiving reports from distant provinces. You shake your head because you're not sure if the answer you know is the one he wants to hear. You know you're Julia, daughter of his daughter who died when you were too small to remember her face. You know your father is Marcus Antonius, though speaking that name aloud makes the servants cross themselves and look away. You know you live in this palace of endless corridors and silent guards, because somewhere in your blood flows the future of Rome itself. "You," he says, rising from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body has survived more battles than it should have, "are a problem that requires a solution." The words hang in the air like incense, heavy and choking. Claudia's hand finds your shoulder, her grip tight enough to leave marks. You'll discover later, when you're alone in your small room with its single window that looks out onto the courtyard, where prisoners sometimes stand in chains. Augustus walks to the window, his purple-edged toga trailing behind him like spilled wine. The afternoon sun catches the gold threads woven into the fabric, but it can't warm the ice in his voice when he speaks again. "Your father was a traitor," he says to the glass, as if you're not standing 3 feet away, with tears starting to blur your vision. "Your mother was my blood, but she chose poorly. That makes you." He pauses, and you hold your breath until your chest burns. Useful, perhaps, if properly managed. Claudia's fingers dig deeper into your shoulder, and you realize she's not trying to comfort you, she's trying to keep you from running. Not that there's anywhere to run in this palace, where every door leads to another corridor lined with guards who answer only to Augustus. "There's a family," he continues, turning back toward you with the same expression he might wear while discussing grain shipments or tax collection. "Respectable, loyal. They've agreed to raise you as their own daughter, to give you their name and their protection. In exchange, you will forget this conversation ever happened. You will forget who your father was. You will become what Rome needs you to become." The wooden doll slips from your fingers and hits the marble floor with a sound like breaking bones. Augustus glances at it, then at you, and something that might be pity flickers across his features before disappearing behind the mask of imperial authority. "Or," he says, and the single word carries the weight of crucifixes lining the Appian Way, "we can discuss other arrangements." You understand, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of absolute helplessness, that you're being offered a choice between losing yourself and losing everything. The girl named Julia, daughter of Antonius, granddaughter of Augustus, will die in this room either way. The only question is whether something wearing your face will walk out alive. Claudia's hand trembles against your shoulder as she speaks for the first time since entering the room. The child accepts your generosity, Caesar. Her voice cracks on the words, and you realize she's crying without making any sound. Augustus nods, as if this outcome was never in doubt. Good. The family lives in Velletri, far enough from Rome to avoid complications. You'll leave tonight, after dark. Claudia will accompany you until you're settled, then return to serve other duties. He returns to his desk, already reaching for another scroll, another list of names to be crossed out or circled. You've been processed, filed away, solved like an equation that was threatening to unbalance his careful calculations. One more thing, he says without looking up. Your new family has a son, a good boy, loyal to Rome. In time, when you're old enough, you'll marry him. It will be appropriate. The room spins around you like a child's top, all marble and gold and the smell of power that clings to everything in this palace. You want to scream, to throw yourself at his feet and beg him to let you stay, to let you be Julia for just a little longer. But 6-year-old girls don't argue with emperors, even when those emperors are deciding the shape of their entire future. Instead, you bend down and pick up your wooden doll, its painted face now chipped from the fall. As you straighten, you catch Augustus watching you with something that might be approval. "She'll do," he murmurs to Claudia, as if you're a horse being evaluated for breeding. With proper training, she'll do very well indeed. The house in Velletri smells like bread and honest sweat, so different from the marble perfection of the palace that you spend your first week there feeling like you're drowning in ordinary air. Your new mother, Atia, has rough hands and laugh lines around her eyes, and she speaks to you like you're actually a child instead of a political problem requiring careful management. But you've learned to watch for the signs of performance. And sometimes you catch her practicing conversations in the kitchen when she thinks you're asleep. Yes, Julia's always been such a good girl. She'll murmur to the empty room. Never any trouble at all, our Julia. The words sound hollow when she thinks no one is listening. Your new father, Marcus Livius, is a grain merchant with calloused palms and genuine smiles. But he receives letters sealed with imperial wax that he reads by candlelight and burns immediately afterward. You pretend not to notice how his hands shake when those letters arrive, or how he measures his words more carefully for weeks after reading them. The boy they've promised you to is named Gaius Asinius Gallus, and at 12 years old, he has the kind of serious eyes that suggest he already understands what his future holds. He doesn't treat you like a little sister or a playmate. Instead, he watches you with the careful attention of someone appraising livestock, though he's kind enough about it. "Do you remember anything about before?" he asks one afternoon, as you help him feed the chickens behind the house. His voice is gentle, but there's something beneath it that makes you think of Augustus's calculating stare. "Before what?" you ask, though you know exactly what he means. The other life, the palace life, the life where your name meant something dangerous and your blood carried the weight of empires. "Before you came to live with us," he says, scattering grain with practiced motions. Sometimes you look like you're remembering something that makes you sad. You consider telling him about the cold marble floors and the grandfather who spoke about you like you were a military campaign requiring strategic planning. Instead, you shake your head and focus on the chickens pecking at your feet. "I don't remember anything," you lie, and the words taste like ashes. Gaius nods as if this answer satisfies him, but you catch him watching you more carefully after that, noting the way you sometimes flinch at sudden noises or how you automatically curtsy when adults enter a room. These are palace habits, behaviors learned in a world where the wrong gesture could mean death, and they mark you as surely as if you wore a sign proclaiming your origins. The village children accept you with the easy cruelty of childhood, but they sense something different about you that they can't quite name. You speak too formally, your clothes are too fine despite Atia's efforts to dress you simply, and you know things that grain merchants' daughters shouldn't know, like how to read Latin and Greek, or why certain combinations of foods were considered unlucky at important dinners. She thinks she's better than us, whispers Prima, the blacksmith's daughter. When she thinks you can't hear, acts like she's some kind of princess. If only she knew how close to the truth she is, and how much you wish it weren't so. Being a princess, you've learned, means being a possession rather than a person, valuable only for what you can provide to other people's ambitions. The nightmares start 3 months after your arrival in Velletri. You dream of marble corridors and men in togas who speak about you in third person while you stand right in front of them. You dream of Augustus's hands, spotted with age and power, as he moves pieces across a map that includes your face among the military units and trade routes. Most often, you dream of a wooden doll falling toward a marble floor, and you wake with the sound of breaking echoing in your ears. Atia holds you when you cry, but even her comfort feels calculated now. She rocks you and hums lullabies, but you can feel her thinking about the letters Marcus receives, about the gold coins that arrive regularly from distant relatives, about the future she's helping to construct around your unwilling participation. It's natural to have bad dreams when you're growing up, she tells you, stroking your hair with motions that feel genuine, even if the words don't too. All children go through difficult periods. But you're not all children. You're Julia, the girl who doesn't exist anymore, living in a house built on lies and imperial subsidies, promised to a boy who evaluates you like a business investment. The life stretching ahead of you has been planned by people who will never have to live it, and every day in Velletri feels like practice for a play you never auditioned for. Gaius begins including you in conversations about the future, with an assumption of intimacy that makes your skin crawl. He talks about the house you'll share after marriage, the children you'll raise together, the respectable life you'll build far from the dangerous currents of Roman politics. His certainty about your shared destiny would be touching if it weren't so terrifying. You'll like being married, he tells you one evening. As you sit by the fire, mending clothes, a skill Atia insists you learn despite your obvious unfamiliarity with domestic work. My mother says women are happiest when they have children to care for and a household to manage. You nod and smile because that's what's expected, but inside you're screaming. Not at Gaius, who's guilty of nothing more than accepting the future that's been arranged for him, but at the world that treats 12-year-old girls like broodmares, whose opinions about their own lives are irrelevant to the equation. The village priest, Father Lucius, visits monthly to check on your spiritual education, but his questions have nothing to do with theology. He wants to know if you've mentioned anything about your previous life, if you've shown any signs of remembering things you shouldn't remember. His kindly demeanor masks the eyes of an informant, and you realize that even here, in this simple house with these caring people, you're still being watched. The child seems well adjusted, he tells Marcus and Atia during one visit, speaking as if you're not sitting right there weaving at your loom. No signs of problematic attachments to the past. Augustus will be pleased with your stewardship. The casual mention of your grandfather's name hits you like a physical blow. These people who've become your family, who tuck you in at night and worry when you have fever, are ultimately employees in an imperial project designed to erase everything you were and replace it with something more suitable to Augustus's plans. That night, lying in the small bed in the room that's supposed to be yours, but still feels like an elaborate prison cell, you make a decision that will define the rest of your childhood. You will become the girl they want you to be, the obedient daughter, the willing bride-to-be, the living proof that Augustus's mercy extends even to the children of his enemies. But somewhere inside, in a place they can't reach with their letters and gold coins and careful kindness, you will remember Julia. The real Julia, with her wooden doll and her dangerous blood. and her grandfather who spoke about her like she was a problem requiring solution. Because forgetting completely would be the final victory for people who think children are just raw material for their political projects. And even at 7 years old, you understand that some victories are too important to concede. You're 14 now, standing in a room where your wedding dress weighs more than a suit of armor, and you can hear your future husband vomiting in the chamber next door. The silk rustles like autumn leaves as your attendants adjust the golden clasps, each one worth more than most Romans see in a lifetime. But all you can think about is the sound of Tiberius retching behind those thin walls. "He's nervous," whispers Livia, your soon-to-be mother-in-law, as she enters without knocking. Her smile could cut glass. It's natural for a groom to feel overwhelmed on such an important day, but you've learned to read the spaces between words, and what she's not saying screams louder than what she is. Tiberius spent last night saying goodbye to Vipsania. The wife Augustus is forcing him to divorce to marry you. The morning light streaming through the windows of your dressing chamber turns everything golden, but it feels like the light in a tomb. Your reflection stares back from the polished bronze mirror, and for a moment you don't recognize the young woman looking back. The girl from Velletri, with her simple braids and honest face, has been painted and perfumed into something that belongs in a temple rather than a marriage bed. "The emperor wishes to speak with you before the ceremony," announces one of the Praetorian guards who seem to follow you everywhere now. Even here, in what should be the most private moment of your day, Augustus's presence looms like a shadow cast by the noon sunday. You find him in his private study, the same room where he decided your fate 10 years ago, though now the maps on his desk show different campaigns and the scrolls bear different names. He looks older, more fragile, but his eyes still hold that calculating gleam that makes your stomach clench. "My dear Julia," he says, rising to embrace you in a gesture that feels rehearsed for watching servants. "You look radiant, every inch the Roman matron you were born to be." The compliment lands like a slap because you know what he means. You look like property that's been properly maintained and prepared for transfer to its new owner. Your education, your deportment, even the way you stand with your shoulders back and your chin raised, all of it has been carefully cultivated to serve this moment. "Tiberius is a good man," Augustus continues, settling back into his chair and gesturing for you to sit across from him. "Steady, reliable, not given to the excesses that sometimes trouble younger men." His pause hangs heavy with meaning you're not supposed to understand, but do anyway. Tiberius is grieving the loss of his real wife, and Augustus expects you to be grateful for a husband too broken to inconvenience you with genuine feeling. "Yes, grandfather," you say, because that's what's expected. The word still tastes strange after all these years, this formal acknowledgement of blood ties that feel more like chains than connections. "There will be children, of course," he says, and his voice takes on the tone he uses for discussing military logistics. "Tiberius already has a son by Vipsania, but you'll give him more. Sons who carry both his discipline and your bloodline." He doesn't say, "my bloodline," but you both know that's what he means. You nod, because refusing isn't an option, but inside you're screaming at the casual way he discusses your body as if it's a piece of equipment designed for his political projects. "The children you'll bear won't be yours. They'll be Rome's, raised to serve Augustus's vision of eternal empire, their lives planned before they draw their first breath." "I've been thinking about your mother lately," Augustus says suddenly, and the shift in topic makes you look up sharply. He rarely mentions your real mother, the one who died giving birth to you, as if speaking her name might remind people that you're not really his creation, but something that existed before his careful planning. "She would be proud," he continues, though his expression suggests he's not entirely convinced. "Julia was spirited, independent, sometimes too much so for her own good." The warning in his voice is unmistakable. Don't follow in her footsteps. Don't develop inconvenient opinions about your own life. A servant appears in the doorway, bowing low. Caesar, the guests are assembled. The priests are ready to begin. Augustus nods and rises, smoothing his toga with the practiced motions of a man who's attended more ceremonies than he can count. Come, my dear. Rome awaits its new princess. The walk to the ceremony feels like a funeral procession. Your attendants flutter around you, adjusting your veil and checking that your jewelry catches the light properly, but their chatter can't drown out the sound of your own heartbeat thundering in your ears. Each step takes you further from any possibility of choice, closer to a life that's been scripted by people who will never have to live it. The marriage ceremony takes place in the atrium of Augustus's house, witnessed by every important senator and their wives, all of them watching you with the hungry attention usually reserved for gladiatorial games. You can feel their eyes cataloging every detail: the cost of your dress, the grace of your movements, the expression on your face as you're transferred from one man's authority to another's. Tiberius waits at the altar wearing full military dress, his face composed in the mask of stoic dignity that makes him such an effective general and such a distant human being. When you approach, he extends his hand with the mechanical precision of a soldier following orders, and when your fingers touch, his are cold despite the warmth of the day. The priest drones through the ancient words, but you barely hear them over the roaring in your ears. This is happening. This is actually happening. The girl who once fed chickens in Velletri and dreamed of choosing her own future is disappearing forever, replaced by a political alliance, dressed in silk and gold. Do you, Julia, take this man as your husband, to honor and obey according to the laws of Rome and the will of the gods? Your throat feels like sand, but you manage to whisper, "I do," and the words feel like stones dropping into a deep well. Somewhere in the crowd, you hear Livia's satisfied sigh, and you realize this moment represents the completion of a plan that began before you were old enough to understand what plans meant. Tiberius speaks his vows in the same tone he might use to accept a military commission, his eyes fixed on some point beyond your shoulder. When he slides the ring onto your finger, his touch is brief and impersonal, like a priest performing a ritual he's completed countless times before. The feast that follows blurs together in a haze of wine and forced smiles. Senators toast your happiness while calculating how this marriage affects their own political positions. Their wives offer congratulations that sound like condolences. You sit beside Tiberius at the high table, both of you playing your parts in a performance for an audience that cares more about the symbolism than the reality of what they're witnessing. Late in the evening, as the guests begin to disperse, and the servants start clearing away the remnants of celebration, Livia approaches your table with the satisfied expression of a general who's just won a crucial battle. "Welcome to the family, my dear," she says, placing her hand on your shoulder with the weight of ownership. "I know you'll make Tiberius very happy." But as she speaks, her eyes are already looking past you, toward the future, where her son will rule Rome and her grandchildren will carry forward her bloodline. You understand with perfect clarity that you've just become another piece in her game, no more valuable as a person than you were as Augustus's pawn. That night, as you're led to your new chambers in Tiberius's house, you catch a glimpse of yourself in a window's reflection and barely recognize the young woman staring back. She looks like a queen, draped in imperial purple and glittering with jewels, but her eyes are the eyes of a prisoner who's just realized that her cage, however beautiful, has no key. The first time Tiberius hits you, it's almost gentle, just a slap across the cheek when you laugh too loudly at something Marcus Crassus says during a dinner party. The kind of correction a trainer might give a horse that's forgotten its pacing. The conversation doesn't even pause, as if the sound of his palm against your skin is just another note in the evening's entertainment, and you realize with crystalline horror that this is normal, expected, part of being a proper Roman wife. You touch your cheek afterward, feeling the heat bloom under your fingertips, and catch Livia watching from across the room with an expression of mild approval. She nods once, a tiny gesture that says, "Good, he's finally taking proper control." And you understand that even your pain has been choreographed by people who view your suffering as evidence of a well-ordered household. The bruises are easy to hide at first. A strategic arrangement of your hair, careful positioning in public spaces, makeup applied by servants who've clearly done this before based on how efficiently they work around the discolored skin. Your Egyptian slave girl, Iris, never comments on the marks she covers, but sometimes her hands shake slightly as she blends the powders, and you wonder if she's remembering bruises of her own. Tiberius is under tremendous pressure, explains Livia during one of her daily visits, ostensibly to check on your welfare, but really to ensure you're performing your role adequately. The responsibilities of eventual succession weigh heavily on any man. A wise wife learns to accommodate her husband's moods. She speaks as if physical violence is a weather pattern you should learn to dress appropriately for, something natural and inevitable, rather than a choice Tiberius makes each time his fist connects with your ribs, or his hands close around your throat, just tight enough to leave finger-shaped shadows on your neck. The worst part isn't the pain, though, that's real enough. Sharp and immediate, and impossible to ignore when you're trying to sleep on bruised ribs. The worst part is how everyone around you collaborates in pretending it isn't happening. Your servants develop sudden blindness when it comes to unexplained injuries. Your friends at court become experts at looking just slightly to one side during conversations, their eyes sliding past evidence they're not supposed to acknowledge. Marcus Agrippa visits occasionally, bringing news from his campaigns and gifts for the household. And during these visits, Tiberius transforms into the devoted husband he might have been in a different world. He's solicitous of your comfort, attentive to your conversation, quick to fetch you wine or adjust your cushions. His performance is so convincing that sometimes you almost believe it yourself, until you catch him watching you with the calculating expression of an actor who's mastered a particularly difficult role. "You look tired, my dear," Agrippa observes during one visit, his weathered face creased with what appears to be genuine concern. "Perhaps some time in the countryside would restore your spirits?" You want to tell him that your exhaustion comes not from social obligations, but from lying awake at night, wondering what will set Tiberius off next time. From the constant vigilance required to navigate his increasingly unpredictable moods. Instead, you smile and agree that fresh air might be beneficial, because speaking the truth would require acknowledging realities that no one in this room is prepared to discuss. The pregnancy begins as a secret you keep even from yourself, a subtle wrongness in your body that you attribute to stress, until the morning you vomit into the basin Eros holds for you and see her knowing look reflected in the bronze mirror. When you tell Tiberius, his reaction is immediate and transformative. Suddenly, you're not just his wife, but his air-producing vessel, valuable enough to protect from his own worst impulses. "We must be careful now," he says, and for the first time in months, his voice carries something like tenderness. Nothing must threaten the child's safety. The irony isn't lost on you that pregnancy, the ultimate reduction of your identity to your biological function, is also your first real protection from his violence. He still finds ways to hurt you, but they're carefully calibrated now, psychological rather than physical, designed to wound your spirit while preserving your body's ability to gestate Rome's next generation. Augustus visits when you're 6 months along, his elderly hands surprisingly gentle as he places them on your swollen belly. "A strong child," he pronounces with the authority of someone who's spent decades evaluating human livestock. "I can feel him moving. This one will be a warrior." You don't correct his assumption about the baby's gender, because you've learned that optimism about producing sons is safer than realism about possibilities. But privately, you find yourself hoping for a daughter, someone who might escape the particular crushing weight of male imperial expectations, even though you know that Roman daughters face their own carefully orchestrated destructions. The labor begins at dawn, on a day when Rome itself seems to hold its breath, the city unusually quiet, as if waiting for news from your birthing chamber. The pain is unlike anything you've experienced, wave after wave of agony that makes Tiberius's worst beatings feel like gentle touches by comparison. But this pain has purpose, an end goal that makes it bearable in ways that meaningless violence never was. When the midwife finally holds up a squalling, blood-covered baby, your first emotion isn't joy or relief but fierce protectiveness. This tiny creature, with his "yes, Augustus was right," perfectly formed limbs and strong lungs, belongs to you in a way that nothing else in your life ever has. For the first time since childhood, you're looking at something that exists because of your choices rather than despite them. "A son," announces the midwife to the assembled household, and the cheer that goes up sounds like victory celebration. Tiberius enters the chamber with an expression of satisfaction that transforms his entire face, and when he takes the baby from your arms, his touch is reverent in a way you've never seen from him before. "Drusus," he says, speaking the name like a prayer. "We'll call him Drusus, after my brother." You want to protest that you should have some say in your own child's name, but exhaustion and relief make resistance seem less important than the fact that your baby is healthy and safe. Later, when you're stronger, you'll find ways to assert influence over his upbringing. For now, it's enough that he exists, that you've successfully produced something that will give you value beyond your capacity to absorb punishment. The months following Drusus's birth are the closest you come to happiness in your marriage. Tiberius's pride in his son extends to genuine affection for you as the child's mother, and the physical violence stops almost entirely, replaced by a careful courtesy that feels like luxury after years of walking on eggshells. You throw yourself into motherhood with the intensity of someone who's finally found work that feels meaningful. But even this reprieve comes with costs you hadn't anticipated. Your body, weakened by pregnancy and nursing, becomes susceptible to the kinds of illnesses that thrive in Rome's crowded conditions. The cough that begins as minor irritation develops into something persistent and concerning, leaving you breathless after climbing stairs and exhausted by activities that once seemed effortless. "Perhaps another child soon," Livia suggests, during one of her visits, watching you struggle to catch your breath after lifting Drusus from his cradle. Brothers close in age become natural allies. Drusus will need that support when he inherits his father's responsibilities. The suggestion lands like a physical blow, because you know your body isn't strong enough for another pregnancy so soon, but you also know that your value depends entirely on your reproductive capacity. Once you stop producing children, you'll become just another wife to be endured rather than protected, and Tiberius's violence will return with interest compounded by years of restraint. Eris finds you crying in the garden one afternoon, tears streaming down your face as you watch Drusus sleeping in his basket. "What troubles you, mistress?" she asks in the careful tone servants learn when their owner's emotions might pose dangers to household stability. "I'm trapped," you whisper, the words escaping before you can stop them. "I love him so much, but I'm trapped." She doesn't need to ask who you mean, the baby who's brought you more joy than you thought possible, or the system that's using your love for him as another set of chains. Her expression suggests she understands both interpretations perfectly, and when she reaches out to touch your shoulder, her gesture carries the weight of shared recognition between women who've learned that love itself can become a weapon used against them. That night, lying in bed beside Tiberius while he sleeps the peaceful sleep of someone whose conscience has never troubled him, you make calculations that would horrify the girl you once were. How many more children can your body survive? How long before Drusus is old enough that you can risk asserting some independence? What would happen if you simply stopped cooperating with the role that's been assigned to you? But even as you think these dangerous thoughts, you can feel your son's tiny hand curled around your finger where he sleeps beside you, and you know that whatever rebellions you might plan will have to account for the fact that he needs you alive more than he needs you free. The mathematics of motherhood are cruel that way. Love becomes another limitation, another set of boundaries that define what resistance is possible and what prices you're willing to pay. In the darkness, listening to the sounds of two people breathing who depend on you in completely different ways, you finally understand why your own mother died so young. Sometimes the body simply gives up under the weight of impossible choices, and sometimes that surrender is its own form of victory over the forces that would rather consume you slowly than let you rest. You're 28 years old when you first taste real freedom, and it comes disguised as your husband's departure for yet another military campaign that will keep him away from Rome for months. The kiss Tiberius gives you before leaving feels like a pardon being signed, brief and formal, and carrying the promise of temporary reprieve from the weight of constant observation. "Behave yourself while I'm gone," he says, but his voice lacks its usual edge of threat. Command of the Germanic legions requires his full attention now, and you've learned to recognize when his mind has already moved beyond the domestic sphere where your existence matters. The house feels different the moment his boots stop echoing through the corridors, as if the very walls exhale in relief. For the first week, you move carefully through your expanded freedom, like someone testing ice on a frozen pond. You sleep past dawn without apologizing to anyone. You eat meals in whatever room appeals to you rather than the formal dining chamber where conversation must follow prescribed patterns. Most dangerously, you begin to remember what your own voice sounds like when it's not measured against someone else's potential displeasure. Livia visits on the 8th day of your liberation, sweeping into your private sitting room with the proprietary air of someone who considers your household an extension of her own domain. "You seem different," she observes, settling into the chair across from you with the careful grace of a woman whose every movement is calculated for effect. "Do I?" you ask, not bothering to rise or adjust your posture to project the deference she expects. It's a small rebellion, but it feels enormous after years of automatic submission to her presence. Her eyes narrow slightly, cataloging this shift in your behavior, the way a general might note changes in enemy fortifications. "Tiberius mentioned that you've been spending time in the gardens, alone. He was concerned about the appropriateness of such solitude." The warning is delivered with surgical precision even in his absence. Your husband's surveillance continues through his mother's watchful eyes. But for the first time in years, the threat doesn't make you immediately retreat into compliance. Instead, you find yourself studying Livia's face, noting the way her mouth purses when she's displeased, the slight tremor in her hands that betrays her age despite her efforts to project timeless authority. "I find the gardens peaceful," you reply, and your voice carries a steadiness that surprises you both. Surely there's no harm in a woman enjoying her own property. Something flickers across Livia's expression, surprise perhaps, or the kind of wariness predators show when prey stops running in predictable patterns. "Of course not," she says, but her tone suggests that peace itself might be suspicious in the wife of a future emperor. After she leaves, you walk to your bedroom window and look out at the gardens she mentioned, seeing them with new eyes. The paths you've wandered alone suddenly seem like promises of possibility rather than just landscape spaces between buildings. For the first time since childhood, you're looking at the world beyond your immediate confinement and wondering what might be waiting there. The poet Ovid arrives 3 days later with a letter of introduction from Marcus Messala, one of Augustus's cultural advisors. He's younger than you expected, perhaps 30, with a kind of mobile face that suggests thoughts move behind it, like schools of fish in clear water. His stated purpose is to seek patronage for a collection of verses about transformation, but you sense something more complex in his careful attention to your responses. The metamorphoses, he explains, settling onto the stone bench beside you, in the garden, where Livia's spies can observe, but not easily overhear. Stories of change, of beings who discover they contain possibilities they never suspected. His fingers trace patterns in the gravel at your feet as he speaks, and you realize he's not just describing his poetry, but offering you something like a philosophy of resistance. The idea that transformation might be possible, that the person you've become through necessity isn't necessarily the person you must remain forever. Change seems dangerous, you observe, testing the weight of the words between you. In my experience, those who attempt it often find themselves discouraged. Ovid's smile carries shadows of understanding that make you suspect he's had his own encounters with imperial displeasure. Perhaps, but stagnation has its own dangers. Water that doesn't flow eventually becomes poisoned. The metaphor hangs between you like a bridge you're not sure you're brave enough to cross. But that evening, alone in your chambers, you find yourself thinking about water that flows versus water that stagnates, about the difference between adaptation and death, about the kinds of transformation that might be possible even within the constraints of an imperial household. Your son Drusus, now 8 years old, becomes your most frequent companion during these weeks of relative freedom. Without Tiberius's presence to constrain your interactions, you discover aspects of your child's personality that formal family meals and supervised play sessions had kept hidden. He's curious about everything, full of questions that reveal a mind capable of seeing beyond the surface of imperial propaganda. Why do the servants look away when father speaks to you? He asks one afternoon as you help him practice his letters in the garden pavilion. His stylus hovers over the wax tablet, but his attention is focused entirely on your face. The question catches you off guard, both because of its perceptiveness and because you realize he's been watching family dynamics with the kind of careful attention children develop when they're trying to understand adult mysteries. You want to tell him that servants look away because they recognize violence even when it's dressed in domestic respectability, but that knowledge would burden him with truths he's too young to bear safely. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings, you say instead, which is true if incomplete. The servants are just being polite by giving us privacy for our conversations. He nods, but his expression suggests he's filing your explanation alongside his own observations, building a picture of family reality that no amount of diplomatic language can completely obscure. The thought that your son is learning to read the signs of your oppression makes your chest tight with protective fury and helpless shame. The letter arrives on a Tuesday morning, when the autumn air carries the scent of burning leaves and distant possibilities. The messenger wears no identifying livery, but his manner suggests official business conducted through unofficial channels. The scroll he hands you bears no seal, no signature, just a brief message in elegant Latin that makes your hands tremble as you read. Those who appreciate poetry sometimes gather privately to discuss literature and philosophy. If such conversations interest you, the rose garden behind the Temple of Vesta offers suitable privacy for scholarly discourse. Tomorrow, after the noon sacrifices, should you find yourself in need of intellectual stimulation, you read the message 3 times before burning it in the flame of your oil lamp, watching the papyrus curl and blacken while your mind races through implications and possibilities. Someone you suspect, Ovid, though the handwriting is disguised, is offering you entry into a world that exists parallel to the official social structures of Roman high society. A world where conversations might range beyond approved topics, where your opinions might matter for their content rather than their adherence to imperial expectations. The decision to attend feels like stepping off a cliff, but the alternative, remaining safely contained within the boundaries of approved behavior, suddenly seems less like safety and more like slow suffocation. That night, you lie awake listening to the sounds of the household settling into sleep, and realize that you've already made your choice, that the woman who burns unsolicited invitations without considering their possibilities died somewhere between your first wedding and this moment of unexpected opportunity. The Temple of Vesta, the next day, bustles with the usual religious traffic, but the rose garden behind it feels separated from the city's noise by invisible walls of discretion. You arrive to find 5 other people already gathered. Ovid, as you expected, but also 2 women you recognize from court functions, and 2 men whose faces are familiar, but whose names escape you. "Welcome," says one of the women, Claudia Pulchra. "You remember now, wife of a senator whose political views sometimes diverge from Augustus's preferences. We were just discussing the relative merits of different forms of artistic expression. But as you settle onto the marble bench they've left empty for you, you realize that their conversation encompasses far more than aesthetics. They're talking about freedom, not the dramatic, public kind that ends in exile or execution, but the quiet, private kind that happens in moments like this, when people choose to speak truthfully rather than safely. For 2 hours, you listen to discussions that range from philosophy to politics, to the kinds of personal experiences that women rarely share outside the confines of marriage and motherhood. These people know who you are, know the constraints that govern your public existence, but they speak to you as if your thoughts matter independently of your political value. When you finally return home, the house feels smaller somehow, as if you've grown beyond its capacity to contain you. Iris notices the change immediately, her eyes following you with the kind of careful attention she usually reserves for signs of Tiberius's approaching violence. "You seem different, mistress," she observes as she helps you prepare for the evening meal. "Lighter, somehow." You catch your reflection in the bronze mirror and see what she means. Your face carries an expression you barely recognize, something that might be hope or might be the beginning of courage. Either way, it feels dangerous and necessary, and completely worth the risks you suspect it will require. You're standing in Augustus's private study for the 3rd time in your life, but this time the difference is that you know exactly why you've been summoned, and the knowledge sits in your stomach like a stone made of ice and inevitability. The scroll on his desk contains a list of names, your lovers, your friends, the people who made you remember what it felt like to choose your own desires. And beside each name is a date, a location, evidence compiled with the thoroughness of a military campaign. "Sit," Augustus commands, but his voice lacks the casual authority you remember from childhood. Now it carries the weight of someone who's discovered that his most carefully constructed political asset has developed inconvenient independence, and you can see in his eyes the same calculating coldness you witnessed 22 years ago when he decided your fate the first time. You remain standing because sitting would feel like surrender, and you've spent too many years learning to read the subtle ways power expresses itself to give him that advantage now. The silence stretches between you like a bridge neither wants to cross first, until Augustus breaks it with a laugh that sounds like winter wind through dead leaves. "You've been busy," he says, gesturing toward the scroll with movements that are precise enough to suggest barely controlled rage. "Quite remarkably busy, in fact. My investigators have compiled quite an impressive catalog of your cultural activities. The euphemism would be amusing if your life weren't hanging in the balance. Cultural activities. As if the poems Ovid read in your garden were seditious texts rather than love songs. As if the conversations with Claudia Pulchra about women's education were plots against the state rather than the kind of intellectual discourse that happens in civilized societies. I haven't broken any laws, you say, and your voice comes out steadier than you expected, despite the way your heart is trying to beat its way out of your chest. Augustus raises an eyebrow with the kind of theatrical surprise that suggests he's rehearsed this conversation in his mind multiple times before summoning you, haven't you? Adultery is illegal, my dear granddaughter. Treason is illegal. Corrupting the morals of Roman matrons is illegal. Shall I continue? Or would you prefer to save us both time and acknowledge the scope of your misunderstandings about appropriate behavior? The word hangs between you like a sword, and you realize that this isn't really about adultery or morals or any of the specific charges he's threatening. This is about control, about the fact that you've remembered how to exist as something other than an extension of imperial will, and that independence is more dangerous to Augustus's vision than any external enemy. What do you want? You ask. Because dancing around the inevitable seems less important now than understanding the exact shape of your destruction. His smile is the same one you remember from childhood, the expression he wore when explaining that your father was a traitor and your future would be whatever served Rome's needs. I want you to understand that choices have consequences, that the freedoms you've been exploring were never actually yours to claim. He rises from his desk and walks to the window that looks out over the forum, his hands clasped behind his back in the pose he adopts when addressing the Senate about matters of imperial importance. You realize he's not just speaking to you but performing for posterity, creating the official version of this conversation that will justify whatever decision he's already made. Your behavior has become a scandal, he continues without turning around. The wife of my chosen successor, the mother of my great-grandson, conducting herself like a common prostitute. Do you understand what that does to the dignity of our family, to the stability of the succession I've spent decades arranging? The word prostitute hits you like a physical blow, not because it's true, but because you recognize the deliberate cruelty in his choice of language. He's reducing everything you've experienced, the intellectual connections, the emotional intimacy, even the physical pleasure that felt like rebellion against years of marital duty, to something transactional and degrading. I'm still the same person I was yesterday, you say, though you know that's not entirely true. The woman standing in this room has learned things about her own capacity for resistance that the obedient wife couldn't have imagined. No, Augustus says, finally turning to face you with an expression that could freeze the Tiber in midsummer. Yesterday, you were my granddaughter, Tiberius's wife, Rome's future empress. Today, you're a problem that requires a solution. The echo of his words from your childhood makes your vision blur momentarily, but you force yourself to stay focused on his face, to read the decision that's already been made in the set of his mouth, and the way his eyes won't quite meet yours. Pandateria, he says, and the single word contains your entire future. The island is suitable for someone who requires time to reflect on their obligations to family and state. The climate is healthful, the accommodations adequate. You'll have books, writing materials, servants to attend your basic needs. You've heard of Pandateria, a rocky outcrop in the Tyrrhenian Sea where political inconveniences go to disappear from history. No visitors, no correspondence, no possibility of return. It's death disguised as mercy, exile presented as an opportunity for spiritual improvement. My son, you say, and the words come out as barely more than a whisper. Augustus's expression softens for just a moment, and you catch a glimpse of something that might be genuine regret. Drusus will be cared for, educated properly, raised to understand his responsibilities to Rome. He'll be told his mother died of a fever. It's better that way, cleaner for everyone involved. The casual way he discusses erasing you from your child's memory makes something inside you break in a way that feels final and irrevocable. Not just your heart, though that's certainly shattered, but something deeper from the last connection to the person you were before this conversation began. When, you ask? Because knowing seems important, even though the answer will only confirm how little control you actually have over any aspect of your existence. Tonight, a ship is waiting at Ostia. Your servants have already been informed that you've taken ill and require sea air for your recovery. By morning, Rome will know that Julia Augusta has retired from public life due to failing health. Even your exile has been packaged in lies, designed to protect the imperial family's reputation. You're not being punished for adultery, you're quietly disappearing, to spare everyone the embarrassment of acknowledging that Augustus's carefully arranged political marriage produced a woman who insisted on having desires of her own. The walk back to your chambers feels like a funeral procession for someone who's still alive. Your servants move around you with the careful efficiency of people who've been given instructions they don't fully understand but dare not question. Your clothes are already packed in leather trunks that speak of permanence rather than temporary travel. Drusus finds you in your sitting room as the sun begins to set, drawn perhaps by the strange energy that surrounds impending departures. At 9 years old, he's old enough to sense that something significant is happening, but too young to understand what your absence will mean for his own future. "Are you really sick, mother?" he asks, settling onto the couch beside you with the kind of careful attention children develop when they suspect adults aren't telling them complete truths. You want to explain everything, the impossible choices, the political calculations that treat people like game pieces, the way love itself becomes dangerous when it conflicts with imperial planning. Instead, you pull him close and breathe in the scent of his hair, trying to memorize everything about this moment that will have to last for whatever remains of your life. Sometimes, you tell him, grown-ups have to make difficult decisions to protect the people they love most. It's not really an answer, but it's the closest thing to truth you can offer someone whose own future depends on believing the official version of your disappearance. He nods against your shoulder, and you feel his tears soaking through your dress even though he makes no sound. The ship that takes you to Pandateria cuts through dark water under a moonless sky, and you stand at the rail watching Rome's lights disappear into the distance while guards pretend not to notice your tears. The island that will become your prison appears at dawn, a jagged piece of volcanic rock rising from the sea, like a stone fist thrust toward heaven in a gesture of permanent defiance. Your villa is comfortable enough, situated on a cliff overlooking water that stretches to every horizon without interruption. There are servants, books, materials for writing, everything Augustus promised, except the possibility of human connection that makes life bearable. The guards are polite but distant, careful never to acknowledge you as anything more than a responsibility they've been assigned to manage. The first year passes in a haze of grief and adjustment, learning to fill days that have no natural structure beyond the rising and setting of the Sunday. You write letters you'll never send, tend a garden that grows only herbs stubborn enough to thrive in salt air, and slowly discover that solitude has its own brutal honesty. Without the constant need to perform appropriate behavior for watching audiences, you begin to remember who you were before political necessity shaped you into something useful to other people's ambitions. The woman who emerges from this process is harder than the girl who left Rome, but also clearer about the difference between surviving and truly living. Years blur together like waves against the rocky shore, marked only by the changing of seasons and the gradual graying of your hair. Word occasionally reaches you through new servants who replace the old ones. Tiberius has remarried, Drusus is thriving under imperial tutoring, Augustus grows older but clings to power with the tenacity of someone who can't imagine the world continuing without his personal supervision. On your final morning, for even exiles eventually die, you stand at your window, watching the sun rise over water that carried you away from everything you once thought mattered. The woman reflected in the glass is someone Augustus never met, someone who learned too late that the greatest rebellion isn't dramatic resistance, but simply refusing to disappear completely. You've spent 13 years writing your own version of your story, the true account that will never be read but exists anyway as proof that Julia the person survived, even when Julia the political symbol had to be destroyed. In the end, that distinction matters more than any of the titles or positions you lost when you chose to remember that you were human before you were useful. The waves that witness your last breath have been wearing away this island's edges for thousands of years, patient and relentless and completely indifferent to the political calculations that once seemed so urgent. Your story joins the countless others of women whose lives were consumed to build monuments to other people's ambitions, a pattern that echoes through history, wherever power treats human beings as raw material for their grand designs.